General Gina Grosso. Lieutenant General Gina Grosso is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Manpower, Personnel and Services, Headquarters, United States Air Force, Washington, D.C. General Grosso serves as the Senior Air Force Officer responsible for comprehensive plans and policies covering all life cycles of military and civilian personnel management, which includes military and civilian end strength management, education and training, compensation, resource allocation, and the worldwide United States Air Force Services Program. General Grosso entered the Air Force in 1986 as a Reserve Officer Training Corps distinguished graduate from Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She has held several command and staff positions throughout her career. As a staff officer, she served as an operation analyst, personnel program analyst, Air Staff and Office of the Secretary of Defense Action Officer, Major Command Director of Manpower and Personnel Directorate of the Air Force Colonel Management Office, Director, Manpower Organization and Resources, and Director of Force Management Policy. Her command tours include a Headquarters Squadron Section, Military Personnel Flight, Mission Support Squadron, command of the Air Force's sole basic military training group, and as Joint Base and 87th Air Base Wing Commander at Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, New Jersey. Prior to her current assignment, she was the Director of the Air Force Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office of the Vice Chief of Staff, Headquarters, United States Air Force, Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant General Gina Grosso.
Hey, good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. Please sit down. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for hanging out with me at 7:30 on Friday morning. Colonel Hastings told me he challenged you to ask tough questions, and I certainly hope you do. I'm going to come down here. I feel like I'm lording over you. And I'm not going to, I want you to know, my style, I have slides, and some of them I think may tee up some issues that are interesting to you, but I basically have 55 minutes with you, and I have a huge job jar. So I'm happy to talk about whatever you want. And I'm hoping that we have a dialogue throughout this 55 minutes that I have with you. So let me go to the next slide, please. I like to start with this one because people tend to have a lot of opinions on the personnel community. So when you think of AFPC, and I know I've got a huge diverse audience here, so even if you're in another service, my sense is the challenges for all of the services are the same. But so what's the first thing that popped into your mind when you think about personnel, either at the base level, your MPF, or AFPC, or what's the first thing you thought of? What? I can't hear you. What, a little louder?
The AMS robot.
Oh, AMS robot. Now, is that a good thought or a bad thought? Bad thought. And how come?
It's just impersonal and it removes control from commanders.
Okay, impersonal and removes control from commanders. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. What else? That's
for training.
Wow, you are the second. Usually that's the first answer I get. Closed for training. So both of these are sort of a customer service concern. Anyone else? How about some civilians in the room? Because you have a little bit different experience. Yes, sir. Slow. Actually, very slow. Yeah, so I think as a community, we have a lot of work to do, and I can talk about the reasons why we're there. If you could go to the next slide. I like to show this slide because what you're really talking about is the customer service aspect of the human capital enterprise. But if you look at the enterprise mapped out from left to right, we basically start with the strategy, and we have people that execute and your airmen that execute that strategy. So I think the most important part of this slide is really, if you look at combat power, we have people, you have human capital. We keep changing these buzzwords. I've been in almost 30 years, and all the words change a little bit. Talent management is sort of the new buzzword in our world. And then you have these things called platforms, and platforms could be anything that's not human capital. So you could call it equipment, you can call it planes, you can call it maintenance, you can call it supply, logistics, but you have people and you have things, and if you put those two together, you have capabilities for the joint fight. And so along that human spectrum, we have to bring people in, we have to recruit talent, we have to develop talent, we have to get the talent in the right place, we have to take care of their families, you and your families, and then hopefully we successfully separate you. But that is the whole human capital. But it's interesting because what pops in your mind is the customer service interface. But as you start, you're at the mid-level now, and I presume a good number of you will go to a staff, and a good number of you will go back to a unit. And so now you're part of that team that's got to be work the inputs, frankly, because as you look at the challenges we face in the future, all of us need to be recruiters, especially to tap into this diverse talent that this nation has, which is a huge strategic advantage for us. But you've also got to create that combat power. And you'll be finally in this position where, to your point, the gentleman who talked about the AMS robot, you'll have much more ability to help your airmen and really put some more of the face back into the enterprise. And has General Goldfein had a chance to talk to you yet, the new chief? Yes, he has. Because if you think about his kind of refocusing on the squadron, I mean, that's pretty cool for you guys in my view. Because if you think about the resourcing decisions we've made, and some of it may not be visible where you were, but what we did, and one of the reasons why we have an AMS robot is because as we tried to manage resources in a resource-constrained environment, we centralized everything. And so there's fewer and fewer people. And we didn't even, really the level of support went to really a wing level in a lot of places. So when you look at the lens, by merely changing the lens to the squadron, that will have significant changes in resources. And some of you, we may be able to get some of those resources back in place before, if you go to a squadron from here. But for some of you that have an intervening, I think you'll really see it's a dramatically different focus, and it will hopefully help put more human into the process. So let's go to the next slide. This one's an interesting question because it gets to both tactical and strategic. If I asked you, do you think you're fairly compensated? Who thinks they're fairly compensated? Who does not? Who's willing to? Yeah, great. They're all concentrated in the back row, because I don't know if is that correlated or not. So what is it about your compensation you think is not fair? And frankly, my personal view is there's probably a lot more people that think that are just not willing to say it. Yes, ma'am. I said, yes, sir. I'm sorry. Right, who fought the war. Yeah, thank you. And that's very helpful to segue. I saw a civilian hand up. Yes, sir.
I don't believe that the Air Force retains the STEM population, and I think part of it is because the benefits aren't comparable to industry.
And you see, in terms of STEM. Yeah, I think you brought up a key point. So really, we compete on the labor market, and I think as a nation, so from a strategic perspective as a nation, we are really struggling to understand what should we pay people that are willing to protect and defend this nation in an environment where you don't have enough money. So if you go to the next slide. Next slide, please, if you can. So this gets to the point about kind of who paying it on the backs of the people that are currently fighting the nation's war. 15 years, it's been a very long war, which is not common for our nation. And so the question about why are they doing it, because we have this resource-constrained environment. And I know this slide has a lot on it, but I don't think a lot of people even realize that on the military side, our compensation includes our basic pay, our basic allowance for housing, your subsistence, and they include the tax advantage. And when you look at that red line, the red line basically says military pay is rising dramatically faster than the equivalent civilian private sector pay. And so go to the next slide real quick, please. One more. So this slide tells you basically since 2000, so just prior to 9/11, the price of an airman was approximately $58,000. And even though we've had a pretty steady, slightly reduced end strength, the cost of the person has doubled. And so and this is really the DOD, is they try to balance the things we really need to be an effective fighting force, and people are part of it. Really what they're trying to do is slow the growth of compensation. So they're not trying to cut, nobody's going to get less, but they are trying to slow the growth. But that's a very hard message. It's a very hard message. And then we compete on the labor market, to your point, the point in the back there. And the all-volunteer force, which we instituted in the close shortly after the Vietnam War in 1973. The bottom line, the all-volunteer force, we compete on the labor market. And so this idea of what is fair compensation for the military, I think is a very strategic idea, and I think the nation struggles with it. And I think nobody wants to admit that that they feel like they're not compensated or not, but we know that we are not retaining, in particular, officers, and it's across all career fields because we are competing with industry, and it's not all monetary compensation. Some of it's non-monetary. Go back to the circle slide. So what this slide tells you is $30 billion, 30.5, almost $31 billion is the cost of, and this is just the military component. If you add the civilian component, it's about 50%. It's about 50% of the Air Force budget, which is about $120 billion. And so again, is that a lot or a little? I mean, that's very hard to know. If you talk to UPS spends about, I think, 80 to 82% of their total annual budget on people. So, and we say people are our most important asset. But this is, as we start to make trade-offs, and I think you'll really see this, especially the folks going back out into the units, and how is your enlisted team doing? Because obviously they get paid less than we do. But you may have some young officers as well, depending on how many children they have, at lower grades, how are they doing? Go to the next slide. One more. Thank you. So this to me gets me directly into this discussion about the retirement reform. And it's interesting because I've heard why do you think the DOD sought retirement reform? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Does anybody know why? What? One person? I couldn't. I heard.
So a very small percentage of the people were actually getting benefits.
Exactly. I'm sorry, but you also said what, sir? Unsustainable. I'm not sure I would agree it's unsustainable. Really, it was really to your point in the back, although some people agree with you, and that's not to say there are some people that absolutely believe that. But to the person in the back, you're right. I think fundamentally that's what it was about. The vast majority of people that serve leave with nothing. And we got TSP, I think I was a major, so maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And the DOD always fought TSP because they did not want to endanger that fixed benefit retirement. But really, the whole retirement reform, there are people that believe we will not attract, because again, we compete on the labor market. So we will not attract this millennial generation because they change jobs a lot, and they expect to have some sort of 401k. So that was really the fundamental reason. And so when they started trying to come up with schemas, basically, to change the retirement, they came up with this fixed benefit, this like blended retirement, which I have not been able to find any private sector industry that has this concept where you have some fixed benefit and some TSP. So it's a very unique model. But the bottom line is airmen coming in after 1 December 2017, so 1 Jan 2018, to get the value of the benefit you have, they have to vest. So they have to match the government vesting. And so it's not necessarily bad, it's just different. And will our younger team, know, do you have enough financial literacy? And those of you going out into a squadron, in this legislation, we are required to do a significant amount by law, and it literally tells you when, in the law, on financial literacy, and because it's really important for the long-term well-being of your airmen. And then, if you have less than 12 years of service, now none of you, we were trying to figure, some of you may have less than 12 years of service because you're really, you're a fast burner, so you'll have to decide whether you're going to opt into the system or not, which is another huge financial decision. But your airmen will be in the new, you have to help your airmen that have to transition, so you're going to have to be able to make sure, to your point about not having this AMS robot, how do you help your airmen make the best decision for them? And then how do you make the best decision for yourself? And frankly, it'll be interesting for us to see, the thing from a human resource perspective, we don't know, we model the force, and we have pretty good models, frankly, that are pretty good predictive models, but we have no idea how this is going to impact the way people stay and don't stay. There's an estimate, the DoD actuary, kind of to your point, every airman that walks in the door, we put money, the DoD puts money into an actuarial account. And they're trying to figure out how much money to put in. So they have to make these estimates of how many people do they think are going to opt in, meaning they're going to leave and get this more money from the DoD. And they're estimating 50%, but frankly, that's a lag. So we don't really know how many people are going to opt in. But we're watching it closely because I think the people that opt in rationally are thinking they're more likely to leave. because they are thinking about wanting to take something with them, and they're willing to sacrifice that longer term, that fixed benefit at 2.5%, which is not bad. So I bring this up to you because when you need to know about it, I think you need to know about it for you personally, but you really need to know about it for the airmen that are impacted by it. And I think time will tell as to whether it turns out to be a recruiting. Do we really need it for recruiting or not? I find it, and I mean, I don't know enough young people right now, but I find it interesting that really they're asking about their 401k. But there is some evidence that that is happening when you talk to the Googles of the world, so who we compete with. And again, then it goes to our compensation. Is that fair? And why do we do it? But really, the cost of the retirement hasn't changed dramatically, and this will not change the cost of the retirement. Certainly not in the near term, for sure. Are people familiar with this? Is this something? I know we put a lot out on it. Next slide. And this just tells you the differences. If you don't have it, you'll have these slides. Next slide. Okay, so the final strategic question. What would you, as the Air Force's kind of chief human capital person, what do you think my number one strategic concern is? Officer retention, I would call that tactical, but it is a concern. It is absolutely a concern. Retention, period, frankly, because it takes all of us, especially as the economy, if it improves. Think a little bit more strategically. Who said that? Excellent. What's your career field? What do you do? Intel. Thank you. You're exactly right. And it's not that diversity is a problem. Go to the next slide. It's the real problem is how do we attract this tremendous diversity that we have in the nation? Because if you look around this room, we're not nearly as diverse as the nation we represent. And so how do we attract people that don't necessarily look like us, aren't from the areas we're from? Because we recruit from a kind of, they call it the smile, pretty much the southern parts of the United States. So we can't even tap into the geographic diversity that we have in the country. And so that is literally my number one strategic concern because of the way we manage the force. Right now, until we're working on changing a bunch of the rule sets that we have, but we really have an up or out system. So people you bring in today are going to be your war fighters 20 years from now. And so if you can't attract them now, we won't have access to all of the talent that this nation has to offer. So that is actually the number one strategic concern. Go to the next slide. And so this kind of just shows you the severity of the challenge, I will say. That the slide on the left, those two lines you see on the left, that shows you basically the white and the non-white population. And I think only in the United States can you have what we call the emerging majority. But that's what the red line is. So in essence, the red line is it's a little more complex, but it's basically fundamentally the non-white population. And this is 2010 census data, and it shows the crossover point at 2025. We know that crossover point is moving to the left. So probably in the 2020, 2021, 2022 timeframe, our country will be more non-white than white. And again, if you just look at the people currently serving, we are a very different demographic than that. And this just shows you as the generations get younger and younger, they get more and more diverse. The people 65 to 85 are 80% white. If you look at Generation Y, 10 to 29 years old, and that's this date is also 2010. So the nation is becoming increasingly less white, which is a huge strategic strength for the United States. So how do we tap into that strength in the country is something that we are spending a lot of time and energy on. Next slide. And this just gives you a kind of a layout. It's one way we're trying to portray, but what's interesting is the most diverse part of our force are our young GS employees. They're most diverse and they're most female. And it's our civilian workforce that's really integrated. But the real concern is you look at the leadership of the Air Force, in particular on the officer side, it's the least diverse of the nation that we serve. And so if you want to attract people coming in, but they don't see anybody that looks like them as from where they're from, it just shows you the challenges that we have. Next slide. And this slide is really how we think about why diversity is such a strength. If you think that, if you look at the differences by someone who's grown up in Moscow, Dublin, or Damascus, and how different they are just from their experiences, where they grew up, their culture, maybe their religious background, their socioeconomic, and then you just overlay that on the United States. And if we can just tap into this phenomenal diversity that we have in the United States, that's why it's such a strategic advantage. There's no nation in the world that has been able to integrate the numbers and kinds of people that we have in the United States. And that's not to say we have it all right, but there's no other nation that looks like the United States. And I was just talking to someone in the last couple days. It was our A9, our chief analyst, really, really smart guy. And he was sharing with me that there's some data that if you look in our most important allies in Europe, France as a nation may not have any native French people in the next 20 years because their population, because their birth rate is low. So they're getting a lot of immigrants. So they are becoming immigrant nations as well, but they won't have native French, they won't have native German. And if they can't successfully integrate, and if you look what's happening now, it's a challenge for them. This tells you why it's an even greater strategic problem, because we may not be able to rely on those allies that are critical for us today. So how do we tap into this is something we're spending a lot of time thinking about, and we will ask you to spend a lot of time helping us with that. And I think it also is incumbent upon you to how do you create an environment where people thrive and looks attractive to someone that maybe has no experience with the military whatsoever, because we also know that as the military gets smaller, less than 1% of the nation has someone in their family that has served. But something like 40 to 60% of people that serve have someone that has served in the military. So that pool is even shrinking more. So this is a really big challenge for us. Any thoughts on this? Anybody? Is this new news to you? Any kind of ideas from where you sit that's obvious that we should be doing? Do you agree it's a challenge? Because not everybody. Yes, sir. But there's a lot of actual data that shows that the more diverse, and that the problem is diverse is a hard word to define, but and so what drives diversity of thought? Go to the next slide. I think I'll show you there's a wheel that's the compendium of people that really spend a lot of time thinking about this to help people really understand what we mean by diverse, because it's a lot of different things. But certainly your ethnicity has some impact on what you think and why you think what you think. And so you're exactly right. But there's a lot of evidence that shows diverse workforces have better results. And they think it has something to do with, there's a term called disruptor. And because, this whole idea of groupthink, because they've had a different experience, they have a different lens, and they're a disruptor, which causes better performance. That's what some of the research thinks. But I'll show you the wheel chart, because you're right, diversity is way more complex than your race, your ethnicity, your background, your religion. It's way more. Way more diverse than that. But the bottom line, it's a strategic strength that we have if we can tap into it. But we know we don't right now. I mean, look at the number. We have half of the country are women, and we certainly don't have our ranks are not 50% women. And I'm not saying that we should, but do they even know that this is a good place? And I happen to believe the military is a really good place for women. Do they know it's an opportunity for them? Is really what we want. Next slide. So how do we get to these? I mean, that is a strategic concern. Someone talked about pilot manning. How do we get to some of these human capital issues for 30 years out? Because there's a very interesting. I've been in, as I said, 30 years, and we've had strategies. We've always sort of had a strategy, and some, depending on which chief we have, we update it and we focus on it more. And we put a lot of intellectual energy the last couple of years on our strategy. But this is the first time in my Air Force experience where we actually tied our human capital strategy to the long-term strategy, because in the long-term 30-year strategy, we just assumed we'd have the human capital to prosecute whatever we needed to do. And we know that that's not a good assumption. We know right now that's not a good assumption. We know right now there's talent that we don't have that we need right now. So at least our annex and the way we are thinking about human capital is aligned to get us airmen that we think can be able to prosecute the war that we are planning for 30 years from now. So I think that's hugely, hugely important. Next slide. And there's a lot of, because the Secretary of Defense, I'm sure have you all heard of Forces of the Future? Is that a term that's familiar to you? Yes, no? Anybody? No? That's not familiar to you? So the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Carter, really one of his huge initiatives, he's going to be a SecDef for a very short period of time. And his belief is that if he's going to he wants to leave a department that is not only better 5 years from now, but for the SecDef 2 and 3 after him has the world's greatest military. And this is him talking, and he believes that the policies and practices that we have today to manage people, these very much World War II constructs, will not ensure that we have the world's greatest military 30 years from now. And so his initiative is, he calls it Force of the Future. And it has been on overdrive since he took over, because he knew he had a very short period of time. But I will tell you, it's great to have the Secretary of Defense champion this, because that's where you drive real change, because a lot of the rules that we have are steeped in law and in policy. So having him champion that has been tremendously helpful. But what I will tell you is, because we had already done the intellectual work 2 years ago on our human capital annex, we drove a lot of what you see in Force of the Future. And the only thing that this slide does is tell you there's nothing that the Secretary of Defense has come up and that he's asking the department to do and the Air Force to do that we haven't really already got in our annex. This just helps us give money, and it helps us get the policy initiatives that we need to. And so some of the things that we're looking at in things like Force of the Future are I would call it a milestone promotion system. So, I mean, how many people think that we have the promotion system is perfect? I mean, that we've got it and it produces the best results. And this is predominantly, we've done a lot of work on the enlisted system, as you know. So this would be an officer system. I saw somebody shaking their head. You know what, we hear from people that separate. Some of them are, well, you hear a lot, in fact, in the operational world, can't I just stay doing what I'm doing, in particular as a captain? I like flying. I like being an intel person. I like being a flight commander. Why can't I'm good at it. Why can't I continue to do that? Well, the reason you can't continue to do it is because we have an up or out system. And so if you don't move on, the person can't come behind you, and then you can't get promoted because you must, by law, we have promotion window requirements. And so it's very much designed, this very much World War II model, when the force was way too senior, basically literally after World War II. So it's designed to push people through. But if you've got all of this talent that's really happy doing what they're doing, how can we accommodate that? Why would you take your best people that like that, operating at that flight commander level, especially if you can serve longer than 20 years and people are living longer? But you can't because of the promotion system. So we're trying to get some legislative relief to start testing some of this milestone approach. So meaning you wouldn't meet a promotion board till you've met a certain milestone. And so I think it'll help all different kinds of specialties, and it will really help with families as well. So if your family's in a good place and your spouse or your significant other is in a good place and you're just not ready to move yet, and we can keep you there longer, and I mean, that's just one of the flexibilities that we think would be helpful. There's a lot of discussion about lateral entry. I mean, how do we bring in talent from the private sector, and at what level do we bring it in? We think that's an interesting idea. So, I mean, how would you feel about taking some Google expert, or maybe SpaceX, maybe, I don't know if we have any space operators in the room, and bringing them in as a major because they're a really good technical expert. What do you think about that? Yes, sir.
Ma'am, speaking from the reserve medical side, there's a challenge with the current promotion system and retirement because we're already doing that with doctors. And the problem is when they come in as a senior captain or a junior major, they are being pushed out because they are making rank, not having any retirement because they can't make their 20, and they're being mandatorily separated because there's no overgrade rank granted from A1, and recruitment services not bringing in enough people.
On the
On the medical side, so specifically doctors and dentists, on the reserve side, we're having problems with wings going non-current because there's no flight surgeons to be able to keep our flyers supported.
But do you think it's because of
There's a disconnect because we're bringing people in mid-career on a ramp, but because they're promoting you, you hit colonel within 10 or 12 years, but you're not getting your 20 to retire, so they're leaving, they're being forced out because they can't get an overgrade waiver, and now they also don't have any retirement. So that is a concern if you're going to bring in people from the outside mid-career, they're not going to be able to stay in for 20.
I follow you. Yeah, so it's another rule that we have to change. Now, it's interesting because we already, to your point, we already do this on technical skills. Well, I would call them technical professional. Lawyers, certainly docs, nurses, some of the other health professions. So we already do some of that. And I think there's some strengths. Any other, and we thanks for, I'm actually the total force A1. So I don't know if we're already working that piece or not in the reserve component. But we should, because we've lifted all the age. I mean, we lifted all the age requirements, so it's not an age thing.
Your director's not making it down to the magic number.
But again, yeah, it's. I'm sure there's multiple reasons. But how about some of the non-technical professional? Because there's a lot of skills in this room. How would you feel about somebody that comes into your unit? So say you're a squadron commander and you get a field grade officer in that spent their time in industry, and all of a sudden they've gone through some form of OTS. We'd have to figure that out. Do you think that's good or bad? Bad? So who's in the bad camp? Okay, and why? I saw your hand.
The reason why I think it's bad is because they don't have the military understanding of the background, they haven't lived the experience, they come in and charge people who have. In World War II, when they had people from ministers come in, they were automatically already reserve officers anyway, so they had that military background. Some of them have been active duty within the industry. So when you're pulling them in like Doolittle or whatever, that's a little bit different than pulling some guy off the street who hasn't done any military service, has no idea what you're going to do, and just has a technical skill set. They're very stovepipe in one little small spot. They're giving them advanced rank for people who have more graduate experience.
Any other on the bad side? How about good? Does anybody think it's a good thing? Great, yes, ma'am.
So one, my great grandpa was actually brought in as a CE. He helped start it up, and he gained a rank of E8, E9 automatically because he had an instruction set. So we helped build that for the Navy. Gave them that set by bringing in those upper level people who understand how to build. So that's a good thing. The bad part, however, is, like he said, you don't understand military. So I'm in acquisitions. You go talk with the lab guys. They don't necessarily always see a connection between operations and the basic research that they're doing. So I see both sides of it, ma'am, but at the same time, I think that you need to have that military understanding or the overarching military understanding that civilians don't get as they grow and as they go through and get to use.
Yes, sir. Oh, for this. Oh, yeah. Do we have? Oh, yeah. Here, I can. Yeah, I think it's an I happen to, my personal view is really agrees with your view that I think our best lateral entry is our reserve component and bringing down all of the barriers, and they are significant, frankly. And a lot of it's steeped in law, but a lot of it is duty status that we are working very hard because that's our best, I think that's our best lateral entry. But that may be short-sighted. I think in particular we need intel people and we need cyber desperately. And so I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure we think it that way, because then I could also argue myself that we do it very successfully with docs, dentists, and lawyers. So, yes, sir, please. Oh, you're the mic person. I see. Thank you. And so, and this is an idea that's very in vogue with the senior leadership. How do we tap into this talent that's already out there? But I mean, General Rice, the new Air National Guard commander and General Hyten, and both told me stories, and these are different airmen up in Silicon Valley. And he said, General Hyten said he went to, I think, a commander's call. Obviously he owns all the Space Command. He's got the cyber mission lead, and he parked next to the senior airman that had a Maserati, and he just happened to go into the building together. And so he's like, hey, what's up with this? What do you do? And apparently this senior airman is a senior executive, I think it's at Microsoft, but he wanted to give back to the nation, and he wanted to do it at that tactical level. So it's not about money. I mean, it's about, in the bottom line in the cyber world is if you want to shoot and you want to shoot legally, the only place you can do it is in the United States military. And the one thing I'm pretty happy, General Hyten also shared with me, that they have this big hacking competition. There's a name for it, where high school students compete. But the two that won, it was a male and a female, and ironically they are from the same high school, and that they won this competition. And what's awesome is we were able to attract them in the Air Force, which I am thrilled with. They are at the academy right now. They had perfect SAT scores as sophomores in high school. So the neat thing is we are attracting them. And a part of that attraction is because literally the only way you can legally shoot something is wearing the uniform. And I'm thrilled they came in the Air Force. But the next challenge we have, and again, this will be your challenge for you, though, going into the training world. Right now we require every officer and enlisted person to go to tech training. We call them something different. These cyber graduates know more than the instructor that they are teaching them, because that technology is changing so fast. So if you think about this capability and this lost productivity, so we get this person that knows probably more than they will ever know when they graduate from their undergraduate, then we send them to training for 9 months, and they know more than the instructor. And for the reserve component in particular, that's even more devastating, because they can attract them, but can these folks go to a tech training for 9 months? So that's some of the modernization we have got to start thinking about, and I think that's true for a lot of our technical skills. But we are in some ways able to attract them, and so that's what we're trying to accomplish with this force of the future. There's this idea. I mean, if you're familiar with LinkedIn, which I think is another very interesting idea for you in particular. So, if you think about how we hire military people and civilian people, you just show up. So when you're a squadron commander, you do not have to spend an inordinate amount of time manning your entire unit. The military people, we work hard to get you the right person, and you might want a lot to say, but my bet is if you got a squadron of 50 or 60 people, you don't want to have to look on LinkedIn, I know I don't, to hire every single person. So maybe select positions you do. Now on the civilian side, you've got to do a lot more work, and I think it's one of the reasons whoever said we're slow, some of that is because the people doing the hiring aren't doing the work they need to do ahead of time. Some of it's the system, because it's a complex system. But there's this idea that we have to have a LinkedIn and we have to better match. In fact, I think it is one of the force of the future taskings to create this LinkedIn system. So individuals can go look at jobs and what they might want to do, and then the hiring person can look at individuals and say, oh, you've got the skill set that I need. But I think there's some great value for the vast majority of airmen, especially on the enlisted side, coming up a full-up round, and for the most part, that's what happens. So not all these ideas, I think, are great. And frankly, we do have a lot of that already in our assignment process. Now, I think I get a lot of feedback on assignments, so I know they are not all perfect. And so what we're working right now is an optimization model where individuals can put their own attributes in if they choose to, and then the hiring person can put what they're looking for. And so obviously we have the obvious, what assignments have you had, what's your education? That stuff's already in the system. So this will get more qualitative data. And then the model will run and see, do we get a better match? But it's not necessarily you have the hiring authority having to go in and look. And we're actually launching that in December with a small subset of the 6-1 career field. So the analyst, and in fact, it's a lieutenant analyst that built this program. And we actually do some of this already in the accession side, but maybe we can get a better ability to match an individual's desire and some qualitative things. So we may have the best, I'll take you as an engineer, but maybe you're fluent in Haitian, and we're having problems in Haiti, and we need to go get some help there. How do we match you? And we can do it now, it's just not very elegant. But so that's some of the ideas on this force of the future and modernizing the force. So I mean, if there's one thing you could change that you think is archaic on the human resource, what would it be? Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
So, ma'am, we talk about constantly trying to get talent in the Air Force, and you're mentioning it right now. We're trying to get amazing talent. The problem I see is the retention piece. We get amazing talent, and then we tell people that to stop doing their primary mission or stop doing their main job to be commanders, to be squadron commanders. And there's certain people that they just want to be the analyst, the pilot. They want to be those career guys. And so you get the evaluator that doesn't want to go the command track, and now they're like, well, I don't want to go to ACSC, but now my career's over if I don't. So at that point, are we talking about any kind of track where we can keep that talent and keep them working for the Air Force without having to go command?
Yeah, actually that gets to this kind of, the only word I've been able to come up was this milestone-based system. And that would get to, I don't think of it as a separate track because that's, frankly, it's from a human resource management perspective, it's much more complicated than that. So, and I'd like to think it's bigger than any one AFSC, but we really are trying to, how do we think about freezing any skill set? It was really to your point, they're really happy doing what they're doing and they're good at it. And across any skill set. And actually the first person that brought this to my attention, which actually was a female officer, she said, hey, I'm doing great, I've just had children, and because there's certain wickets in her career field, I can't remember what it was, and she just couldn't do them. It's not that she didn't want to, she just couldn't do it right now. So 3 or 4 years from now, but the system drives that up or out. And so we didn't, unfortunately, this legislative cycle, all DOTMA, this Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, is driven by law. So we need to get some changes in the law to allow that flexibility. And then we need to make sure that, and there's reasons, the law is important because you can't have people at the top not leaving because then there's no room for the people that do want to come up. So how do we get that right, and how do we make sure that we meet every Air Force requirement, which is always number one. But I think with the technology we have today, but you're right, there's a cultural piece of this. And that's really hard to defeat, honestly, and that's going to be incumbent upon you. I can't change the culture. I can give you all the rule sets, and we're really working hard on that. But until you, the culture, don't, and really you're younger than me, that's why I'm looking at you, and you will be leading airmen that set this culture. So you have to make it okay. And we have this program already in place called the Career Intermission Program, and it's officer and enlisted. But people were afraid, gosh, if I come back in, am I going to be successful? Now, we've had 2 airmen come back in. The Navy is far ahead of us on this, so I don't know who our Navy officers are in the room. And it's basically a freezing. It's a way that you're able to freeze your record and just come back in where you left off. You happen to be 3 years older, but your military career, you're in the same place. Now, the Navy's had great success. We've only brought 2 people back, and it's too soon to tell. But frankly, there's no reason why this shouldn't work. And it's interesting what some people are doing. We had one military spouse take the year off so she could align with her husband. We've had people leave to go start a business. One person wanted to go to school full time. And so there's no reason to believe they're going to be any different. And frankly, it would be pretty transparent in the record. It'll just, if those people that are kind of eagle eyes are going to realize, okay, what a report from 97 and then the next one from 2000. But I mean, so some of these things we have to be flexible as leaders to make things like that okay. Because we have some authorities now. But yeah, I think that's what we're trying to get to, frankly. Yes, sir. Ma'am,
could you talk to why the Air Force is so resistant to go to the warrant officer system? Because that seems to be like the system with the framework that we already have that exists that seems to work for other services.
Yeah. I know I'm zipping around, and I've only got 10 minutes. Can you go to the end strength slide? Keep going. It's way down there. Go real fast. This is great. I wish I had time to talk a little bit about unconscious bias. If I do, I'll come back to it. The reason why we can't is because to make warrants, there's several reasons, frankly, and it's not that we're resistant to it, but first of all, our enlisted force is really, really talented. And so we believe if you really wanted to have enlisted, which we already are working, as you know, on our RPAs, and I hope you know that, we've got the first pilot of enlisted aviators, and well, actually there's some intel too for this first class to learn how to fly the RPA. And there's actually congressional legislation demanding that half of that force be enlisted by 2019, which can't physically happen. So we're still working that. But we feel like we already have the grades in our enlisted force, so we could take masters, seniors, and chiefs. We do not need a separate grade structure between the enlisted and the officer. So that's really issue number one. But issue number two is end strength. So that end strength, to make a warrant officer, you have to take officer end strength. And we don't think we have enough officers in the right skill set. So to take another whatever 2,000, right now I think we have about, I think it's 60,000 officers. I might be off a little bit. To take that end strength to make a warrant officer grade when you don't really need to, that's the other problem. If I could grow end strength, and even if I could grow end strength, I would not take the first 2,000. We would not put to make warrant officers. We have requirements that we can't meet right now that are a much higher priority in our mind. So that's really why. And anything that we move, the warrant officer is more expensive than an enlisted airman. So really, the bottom line is we don't think we need it. Do you buy that, or? Not really. So why? Let me pursue that a little. Because let's face it, let's just say like every fifth, well, it wouldn't be that many, but in every row, 3 people would not be here because we had to take that officer end strength and make a warrant officer. So whatever skill you're doing.
But to the major's point over here, for every person that we train and that we lose at the 4-year mark or the 6-year mark, that's wasted money and capital. And if you can just train folks and you say, hey, you can stay and you can do this job and become a technical expert in it, you don't have to worry about that. So that's kind of my argument. Our seniors and our chiefs, they're now leaders. They're not tactical experts or technical experts anymore. We want them to lead airmen. Our majors, our lieutenant colonels, you want them to lead airmen. There are folks that just want to be technical experts and they can't do it because it's up and out. So the warrant officer system seems to be the fix to that.
So that's interesting. Again, I would argue that's a cultural issue. So you want to take. You don't want a senior NCO, I see, because you see them as a leader. But so what about a staff tech and then a staff or a tech, because they're very technical experts. So I don't get, for me personally, I don't get with that mid-grade, highly technical expert, which would be paid more than a staff sergeant. And I'm not sure you'd retain them. I think the interesting thing is going to be, because again, and this is my point of view, to just be clear, we compete on the labor market. So when we make these enlisted RPA pilots, and we know the whole industry, Amazon's going to start dropping packages on your house with a drone, and I'm sure that's not the only company. So there's lots of demand, and that skill in particular. I think some other skills as well. So I don't think there's the premise that we're going to keep them, I don't think is a good. It doesn't pass my logic test, especially because they get paid less now. One of the things we're working very hard on for enlisted RPA, since we're training the first ones, is just to try to get their pay commensurate with the officers. So from a bonus perspective, whatever we pay an officer, can we get an enlisted RPA operator that's sitting side by side to do the same thing? And right now we can't because we don't have the legal authority. Yeah, it's and it's funny because I get that question everywhere we go. And then if you think about complexity too, it just adds a layer of complexity for you, because you already, as a squadron commander, you have to know how to manage military people, you have to know how to manage civilian people, which is a very different system, which is changing, by the way, how we evaluate civilians. For some of you, you might have some NAF employees, and then you'll have to figure out how to manage this warrant officer. So it adds a layer of complexity too that I'm not sure we need. I brought up the end strength side, so I basically have 5 minutes left. I don't know if I've scratched every itch. Is there any other questions that I haven't talked about that you're really interested in? Because there's so much going on. Yes, ma'am. You can go next.
Good morning, ma'am. Major Chadden from Flight 27. So, question on PT. Last year we had a huge change to the reg, and one of those changes was that we now, for those that are exempt from a component, we're scoring above a 90 are only required to take it once a year. However, that change didn't make it into AFMS, and then talking to folks that are in the SG community, the Air Force is the only service that doesn't have a permanent component exemption. So how are we marrying
Say one more,
those?
say the last thing, a permanent.
A permanent exemption when we do profiles? We do recurring 365.
I'm with you, I'm sorry.
So that PTAFI says permanent, SG community doesn't do permanent. So how are we marrying those up so that we can manage our folks better?
So you don't have to you don't have to be looked at every year, in other words? I mean, what are you trying?
So the A1AFI, as I read it, it says if you have a permanent component exemption, but you still score above a 90, you only take it once a year, which is currently done for those that don't have that permanent component exemption. When you look at a profile, it says 365 days and it's recurring, not permanent. So how, since the A1 AFI says permanent, but the SG community doesn't give permanent profiles, how do we marry those?
I'm looking at my major, so, but I think they're different purposes. So I think the profile's purpose is, should you remain on active duty? Presuming you're in the active component, I think the reserve component is the same, which is a different purpose than your PT score. And I think that's why they don't marry up. But I will ask the SG when I get back, because we have a desire, any airman that can't deploy means other people deploy more. So I can't speak to the other services. I am not aware of what their policies are, but we pay very close attention because it puts a burden on everybody else. And so we make that evaluation every year. Is my guess is the answer.
Right.
But General Welsh, I'm sorry, on the PT piece, he had some really clear ideas because that's when I was A1P, and as soon as he came in the door, I think he thought the PT just needed some adjustment, and I think it's frankly more airman friendly. And the waist measurement makes everybody, I know that's not a popular piece of our fitness testing.
So in just experience having what's command, there's a lot of folks that are still able to deploy that even though they have permanent component exemptions. So I don't think that.
Well, that's true, but they get a hard look. I mean,
Yes,
and depending on
process.
and I'll tell you, it's a lot of overhead because depending on what the exemption is, you've got to go to the COCOM, SG. So just the wickets to do that are a lot of work. I mean, in general, we'd be much more. We didn't spend so much money training and building talent. It doesn't make sense to keep people that can't deploy, honestly, but we do spend a lot of money, and we do have a lot of talent that you can't automatically bring in. So it's this balancing act, I would say. Are you a medic or?
No, ma'am, I'm an aircraft maintainer.
Oh, a maintainer.
I've just had a squadron full of folks having to deal with this.
But I'll talk to the SG and see. But I think, there's a lot going on the medical side right now, actually. And in fact, in the Force of the Future, one of the things they want us to look at is, do we have the right medical standards now? Do we have it right? And should we relook, again, some of these Cold War, because people are living longer. And as you look at where the, I don't know if you've heard about the third offset strategy, but basically the way and I'm sure you'll hear about this in your year here, the way the DoD is, the way the United States is going to keep its edge is basically this interface with man and machine, which really fundamentally changes how we think about a lot of things. So if you just look at technology today, they're already starting to test exoskeletons. And so if you wear an exoskeleton, everybody's as strong as everybody else. So that interface with man and machine and allowing machines to do thinking that's way faster than a human, so you get the best of both worlds, and that's what we think is going to keep the U.S. in a strategic advantage, which will fundamentally change some of these PT questions. But I'll take it back and see if we can get you a better answer. But I think that's what the answer is. Ma'am, let me get you that one back there, and I think that'll have to be it. I don't think you're on.
Ma'am, my name is Watasha Allen in Flight 37. My question is regarding the personnel, the new personnel system, New Beginnings. What are your thoughts on that, and when will that be rolled out to the bases?
Okay, New Beginnings. Hey, is there any chance you can really quickly go to the New Beginnings slide? My short answer is I think it's really important. So we are changing the way we evaluate our civilian workforce, because right now, those of you that have had a lot of interaction with civilians, it's basically a pass-fail. And we can't use that when we have reductions in force on the civilian side. Your performance doesn't figure into any reduction in force action. So I think this new system is really much better. We are probably going to implement 1 April 2017. We're in 2016. But we are still working the negotiations with the labor unions. So we have a big a labor union in the AFMC world that's got 42,000 employees that we may or may not make it. And so then we'll have to decide if we postpone a year or postpone some time, or just have different bases, have different evaluation systems, which we really don't want to do. So right now we're planning for 1 April 2017, and in fact the training is out there because it's not, for those of you familiar with NSPS, it's not NSPS light, but it does start with making, you have to set objectives with your employee. What do they need to accomplish this year? You are required to do feedback, which shouldn't be anything earth-shattering, but 3 times a year you are mandated to get your feedback and your performance, so you know what you're expected to do that year, and you're measured on that performance. And then we'll be able to count the performance if we have a reduction in force. So this has been 6 years in the making, and getting the policy from OSD was work with all of the labor unions at the OSD level, but now we're negotiating at the local level. But I do think it's good. I do think it's going to significantly improve, I think, the experience of our civilian employees, because I just don't think it's inherently fair that everybody gets measured on a pass-fail, because we know there's better performers and not better performers. So it's not fair to those best performers. The training is out there, and that's one. So you need to. I didn't get to this, but you need to know, because anybody leading a civilian, you need to know how to measure their performance, and you need to know the system they're in. And so you need to. I know people get tired of the added training that we have, but to me, this is not an additional duty. This is not ancillary training. You have to know how the performance management system and the people you're responsible for is. So, did I answer your question? Yeah, thank you. I know I'm 1 minute over. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I appreciate your candid thoughts, and I wish you all the best. I would love to be in your shoes, frankly, at the midpoint of my career. So please, thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Well, carry on.
General, on behalf of the class of 76, we'd like to thank you for coming out today, and we'd like to give you this coin as a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Guys, try to do a 5-minute break. Try to be back here by 32. I know it's tight, but try to make a run.